thank you, Ruth and Linda, for having us here. It's a great opportunity for us to share and give back from our experiences. So I just want to say that the remarks and responses that we will be giving to these really good questions will be general in nature, and they may or may not necessarily fit everybody's individual context, but we're offering them as a place to get started and a way to understand some ways to respond to some of the issues that come up as just part of life. So one of the first things we do when we have a new client is to find out all we can about their particular individual unique situation so we can speak more directly to that. So we just invite everybody to take our remarks in their own personal context, but understand that we can't speak directly to what's going on in their lives.
Okay, fair enough.
Yep.
Okay, so the first question is, how do I stop caring what people think about me and or letting it affect my headspace?
Great question. I think just about everybody concerned somewhat about what people think of them. So there's a couple of things I think we need to wrestle with. And one would be the reality that not everybody is thinking about us as much as we think they are. In fact, I think the reality is they're thinking about themselves primarily. The other piece would be that they're not really thinking about us in a way that they could help us understand. What's happening is we're projecting what we're afraid they think about us onto them, and then assuming that's how they actually do think about us. So that's why it's really futile to try to manage our perceptions or what other people think of us, because number one, they're really not thinking about us, and secondly, whatever they're thinking about us is what we're putting on them. So in that case, we have to really look at ourselves and try to understand why we expect to be thought of negatively. The other piece would be it's important to identify why it's so important that other people affirm us or validate us or think well of us. And many times that comes to places in our childhood where we have been hurt, we experience rejection, where we have that need, we have negative self-observations, because none of us are born with any of these things. We pick them up along the way. So I think it's important that we understand that people aren't always thinking about us. Whatever we think they're thinking about us is really coming from ourselves. And to own that and take a look at it and dig a little deeper into what that's about. So those are a couple things to consider. The other piece is it shouldn't be as important to us what other people think of us, because what they think will come and go. People will come and go out of our lives. It's the ones who I know, love, and care for me. They're the ones I want to think well of me. So I think it's important to have that distance from needing to please everybody, because number one, it's not possible. It's really futile, and they're going to come and go from our lives. The people that love me, they're the ones I want to think well of me.
Right. No, I was just going to say, talk about relevance versus irrelevance. I think it is relevant what people who love you think about you, and they can be good sounding boards and good mirrors and help you develop your character and develop maturity. But I think we have to be careful. I say to myself, irrelevant. That's just what I say in my head. When someone's judging me or putting me down, I just say irrelevant. What people who judge me say is irrelevant, and I try to smooth it off. So maybe that will help.
So what about the emotional reaction? I mean, I think, if we say that to ourselves, but then it still affects us emotionally, what are some ways to help us move beyond that so you're not stuck in that emotional state?
Well, I think we get to decide how much we allow someone's opinion to matter to us. I think we really do have the power to control that to some degree. I mean, we all want everybody to love us. Is that going to happen? Absolutely not. And part of that is learning to tolerate that fact that not everybody's going to like us for some reasons that we won't understand. Maybe I remind them of someone who beat them up in the third grade. I don't know. But the reality is they're not all going to like me, and I need to be okay with that and deal with the feelings that come from that. And because one person, for whatever reasons, doesn't like me, doesn't mean that others don't and that I'm unlikable. I think when we take those experiences and make them typical instead of just outliers, then we end up losing self-esteem and feeling like nobody likes us now, which isn't the truth.
Well, and I would say the key to, I think, managing your emotions is really what goes between your ears, what you say to yourself. So being
Well, that's exactly what she was saying, letting it not affect my headspace.
right, right. I really believe it's the self-disciplined, sound mind that helps us with our emotions. That when we pay attention to that thought. In fact, what I tell clients is, if your spirit falls, if you're having an emotional reaction, then ask yourself, why am I feeling this way? And kind of be your own detective. And then you take that and you realize, well, maybe I'm believing a lie, or maybe I'm believing someone's thinking something about me that I'm not. So you capture that thought and you choose to disagree with it. I always tell my clients, spit it out, and we spit it out. Disagree with that thought, and then intentionally and actively choose to agree with the truth. Like replace the lie with the truth. And then that can help us manage our emotions. Does that make sense?
I agree with that, and I also think the intentionality is the
huge.
part. One things we have is a God-given ability, and that is to monitor and think about our thoughts. So with that, we can not control our feelings. We have to feel whatever we feel, but we can decide if we dwell on them. I can't stop what goes through my head, or I can't stop an emotional reaction, but I can decide if I'm going to choose to dwell on it and let it just dig in deeper and collect itself with all the other negative things that I think and end up hurting my spirit.
I think it's huge. Emotions are huge. And we sometimes we let the emotions master us. Other times we pretend they're not there. And the right thing, the healthy thing to do is to acknowledge them. I like to think of them as little allies or little detectives to help me figure out what's going on. And so to ask myself, why did I suddenly get so sad, or why am I mad? And then kind of the emotion is sort of the gateway to the sound thinking, if that makes sense. Okay, feedback mechanism.
Yeah.
So that kind of introspection can be very helpful, because I can think of many times when I've gotten into a bad space and I don't know why I got there.
Right.
And then I go back through my day and just kind of back through hour by hour what happened. And then it hits me, something got said that I kind of blew past, or something happened and that's still sticking at an unconscious level. And at the end of the night, I'm just not feeling good. I'm not in a good headspace. So then I can deal with it after I identify it. And when you do that, then I can decide, am I going to let myself be affected that deeply by some event or someone's comment or something that went wrong on my day? I do think we can choose to not do that, to move on from it.
No, and I think that is an important point. Most people don't stop to think and reflect. They're just so caught up in whatever it was that angered them or ticked them off or made them feel bad. And then you just kind of dwell on that, and then you suddenly become the victim, and so it is. I think that's a very good point that you both make.
And Scott, what we're talking about is being self-aware versus being self-conscious, like just feeling bad about who we are and afraid.
That's a very good distinction. Yeah. The second question that I mentioned is, how do I identify and work on people-pleasing tendencies?
Well, I think it comes back to being aware of what's going on inside you and asking yourself, where does this come from? Why is it so important that these people like me? Or sometimes it's one particular person. We really, really want their approval. And I think the next question needs to be, why is it so important that I have their approval? And sometimes it relates back to our childhood, where we need the approval of a mom, a dad, sometimes a brother or sister, or a peer, and it was just really important and we didn't get it. So there's a wound there. And we need to attend to that and work through that so that we don't have that compelling need, and that person we won't need to have their particular affirmation. So to identify the wound is going to be an important piece. And then in general terms, going back to what I said earlier, everyone's not going to like us, and we need to be okay with that. I don't need everybody to like us. I remember a story of a baseball player who did something on the baseball field, and all the fans in that stadium were booing him and yelling at him. And afterwards, one of the reporters said to him, how did it feel to have all these people yelling at you and booing at you? He says, I don't really care. I'm going home to a family that really loves me. And I thought, what a great perspective. He doesn't need those people to affirm and yell for him. He has a family that loves him.
Okay, and then the third question, kind of tying in with that, is what are ways I can learn to grow in self-confidence?
Well, one thing you can do is you can lean into the the fear. Basically, we're not self-confident because we're anxious or afraid of something, and so you can be intentional and lean into it. But I like to lean into it, not fall into it. So you need to take incremental, healthy, reasonable, sensible risks. So basically, it's the thing we've been told since we were kids: practice makes it easy. You have to practice it, but you don't need to flood yourself. You practice. Well, maybe it's a social situation. You think about what you need to do, and then you kind of break it down into, well, I can handle this, so I'm going to do this till that's easy, and then I'm going to do the next thing, the next step.
Yeah, what I'd add to that is it's important we get to know our real self and be comfortable with who we really are. And that's different. Many of us will get to know our negative self and then collect negative things about that, and then our internal self-talk will be negative. So it's important we know who we really are, because we weren't born lacking self-confidence. Somewhere along the way, our self-confidence got eroded away. And so with that, our internal self-talk, we need to think about whose voice am I really hearing? I spend a lot of time with my clients on helping them understand whose voice it is that they've been responding to. Because what happens if I take in negative things from my childhood, from various sources, parents, teachers, family, I internalize them. And then it starts to sound like my voice. When in fact, it's the voice of those others who I've collected, and I believe them because when you're this tall, these people are right. They know everything, right? Well, unfortunately, they don't, but it's too late by then because I take it in, internalize it. Now I've got a voice telling me that I'm no good, that I'm never going to be any good, that I'm a real slacker or whatever. So it's important to identify that, and the long-term process is to give those voices back to the ones that gave them to us. Make them responsible for their comments that were inappropriate, hurtful, and wounding, and not hang on to it and consider it to still be truth. Because if we don't do that, we'll have these negative things going on for the rest of our lives. They have a life of their own. I remember an experience I had in a 7th grade English class, and I had written something, and my English teacher seemed to have a real disdain for what I wrote. I could see it on her face, and just kind of screwed up her face like, that's really no good. And I remember being crushed by that. I thought, I didn't think it was that bad, but here's my English teacher who knows how to write and what good writing is. That stayed with me all through my high school years and my college years and even into graduate school until I did enough writing that I realized, no, she was wrong about that. I'm not a bad writer. I wish I could remember what I wrote so I could look at it again, but her impression, that look on her face stayed with me until I chose to realize, no, that's not true. You know, I may not be a bestseller author, but I can write and I can explain myself on paper.
And that's so true. I mean, we could have 10 positive, good experiences, but you have one negative, and it's almost like it negates the rest. It's like, because human nature, you focus on that one negative thing. So no, that's very true. And then
Especially the perfectionist.
Those perfectionists.
if there is an area that, let's say, you want to grow in self-confidence, it's taking that baby steps, as you were saying, and then doing it a little bit to
Repeatedly.
and repeatedly, because if you, like, say, you're afraid of public speaking, for instance. Well, maybe, you know, you could join a neighborhood organization that maybe enables you to do something like that. So little steps like that. Yeah, I agree. Okay, great.
Yeah, I think self-confidence comes from becoming confident in what you actually can do and not allowing the fear to keep you from taking those reasonable risks to find out, hey, I really can do this and I'm not going to die. Because we can make our fears huge to the point we're paralyzed.
And
we don't
reasonable expectations.
Reasonable is
Reasonable
the key word there, yes.
Right. Mastery creates confidence.
Exactly.
But it takes time.
It's really hard for me to put myself out there in a social space where I am the minority because I am naturally introverted. How can I stay true to myself and not assimilate to the, quote, majority to fit in? So this, I would love to hear your answer, but I feel like there's kind of 2 layers to this question. But go ahead, I'll let you.
Well, you know, so I personally may not have that experience as a minority in most contexts, but I think everyone can be a minority in different ways. I don't want to minimize their experience, though, I would say to them in a practical way, when you're in a group, look around, make eye contact, smile at people, and whoever smiles back, start up a conversation with them. I could say, there are more people lots more people like me. I'm just interested in people. And when I look at someone, I don't necessarily think, oh, what is their ethnicity or what are they, I'm interested in their life experience. My favorite clients are minority because I learn a lot from them. I ask them questions. I'm really interested in understanding them and their culture. The fit-in piece I wanted to address, be careful when you're trying to fit in. I don't know that you necessarily should try to fit in, but be careful that you don't compromise your own values. Don't do anything that's not you to fit in. Fancy word for that is dissonance. Dissonance is when your insides don't match your outsides. And dissonance research on humans was outlawed in the 70s because it changed your character. The people in the poor college students, it's always college students, in those experiments changed their identity to fit with the dissonance that was created. Consonance is the opposite. It means our insides and our outsides match. So I just really encourage anyone who is trying to fit in, to be careful not to sort of not be yourself.
Right, you don't want to be a chameleon and try to fit in every place just to be accepted, because the sad irony is that if I change who I am to be accepted, then those people are going to like someone and it's not really me.
Right.
And I'm going to know that. They won't know that. They'll take the perception of whatever I put out there, but I'll know that I'm not being true to myself, not being authentic, and I'll lose self-esteem. I won't feel good about myself because I know that's really not me I'm putting out there.
And it is amazing how many people actually don't feel like they fit in to whatever that quote norm is, because sometimes that norm may not really be the norm, but we perceive that to be the norm. But
Fitting in is overrated.
I think so.
I mean, maybe you should think fitting in enough. Like, can I talk to people versus fitting in completely. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think there's degrees to fitting in. I think we do have to, in some ways, adapt to the culture and place we're at without giving up our real sense of self. And I think that's possible, that I can kind of join in and be part of the group without becoming a different person and not being true to my authentic self.
Yeah, I think it really ties into the question of self-identity.
Absolutely.
Of who am I? And most of us don't think about that too much, of who we are, what do we value, what's important to us, and so forth.
Right.
Yeah, and what I have found that those who grow up in homes where their parents need them to be a certain way for the parent to be okay, end up doing that as they go through life, trying to figure out what people want them to be and then being that. And they haven't really developed a strong sense of who they are as a person. They just adapt to whatever other people want them to be and need them to be.
So it sounds to me like then they're trained to be over-responsible for other people's feelings and under-responsible for their own, like their own don't count.
Right. I treated a woman one time whose mother was very much that way. Everything her daughter did, she would take the praise for it, and this girl was just a mirror to her mom, who didn't really have a strong sense of self at all. So it took us a long time for her to get to learn to say no to her mother and to be true to herself and do what she wanted to do rather than her mother. And she was a grown woman at the time. And she made great strides when she realized that she could say no to mom and be who she was, and nobody died. We decided that was the criteria, that if you can do this and nobody died, we're good.
We're good to go. So we're going to shift a little bit in our questions from more personal questions to about relationship with others. And the next question is, what is a healthy way to question motives or ideals in myself and with others?
I think that's a good question. That's something that we all are concerned with. How do we evaluate ourselves, and how do we introspect in a healthy manner? And I think a lot of it has to do with our core values. We need to have a set of core values that define who we are. So I can compare who I am and how I act and my external behavior up against those values and then see how far apart we are. Since perfection is not an option, there's always going to be a gap there. But that would be a healthy way to gauge how I'm doing. One of the cautions I have is, because some of us are a bit more obsessive compulsive than others, I have dealt with folks who introspect ad nauseum. They become obsessive with their second guessing, with their constant ruminations, and that is not a healthy way. That becomes something where they are obsessed and eventually reach what we call analysis paralysis. And they get stuck and can't move forward because they can't figure out what to do next. They get so caught up and bound up. So we need to be grounded in our core values, but understand we're not always going to meet them. And then if we don't, we see if there's something we need to change, and then we move on for it and not get stuck in that analysis paralysis.
Yeah, I just thought be honest and be open to reality. We're probably the best at fooling ourselves. So, and that's where you ask your trusted, the person who loves you, to reality test with you or hold up the mirror and just be honest. Yeah.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you saying is that a healthy way to question the motives in yourself and with others is to know what your core values are, like what's important to you.
That would be for yourself.
Right, for
you
yourself.
wouldn't know other people's.
Right, like so for myself,
Yeah.
what they would be, and that way I could reflect it with it's a gauge.
Right. And when you identify your core values, you're also identifying what your core values are not. So if these are my core values, then other things aren't going to be. And that lets us make better decisions, because we can't do everything. So if this is a core value, I want to be consistent with that, and I won't be doing other things.
The next question asks, how do I establish distance with friends who have become a drain on my energy, but I still care about?
Another great question. So here's my thoughts on that. We need to decide how much time and energy we're willing to give any relationship. I think that's good stewardship of our time and energy, because I know I've only got so much, and when it's gone, it's gone. So I think we need to be intentional and wise about how much time and energy we put into different relationships. We also have to realize that we can't fix everybody, because then we're getting into being codependent. Right. And some people seem to draw on us and want to kind of borrow our energy. And I feel that sometimes when I'm around them, like they're kind of sucking me dry. And then if I let them do that, then not only am I left with nothing, then I have nothing left to give to relationships I really do want to invest in. So we've got to be careful to set good limits and boundaries with people, or they will, in fact, suck us dry. Now, I want to be available to them. I want to let them know that I care about them, but I'm not going to be there every time they want to complain. Because here's something else I found out. Not everybody who complains or is always in a bad place really wants change.
Right.
They really just want to whine about it and complain about it and get my ear and get my sympathy. And when we realize that, I think we need to decide then, I can't give any more energy to this. This person really isn't using what I say to them to be helpful. They're not using my support to get better and make changes. Right. They just want to stay stuck.
Right. And again, I think we need to learn to tolerate tension, tolerate uncomfortableness. I think, again, that's a place where you lean into something that's a little uncomfortable, test that relationship a little bit, like test it with a little bit of truth or a little bit of, in parenting, we talk about optimal deprivation and optimal frustration. You might lean into that relationship and kind of on purpose frustrate them a little bit, like not now, later, I can't do it this weekend, or just a little bit, test it. And if I guess what that does is it exposes the character of the person, your friend. And if they respond with respect or with growth, you've got something much more real starting to develop. Oftentimes, I have usually a wife, sometimes husbands, come to me and they're telling me all about how bad their spouse is. And sometimes I have these, this doesn't sound good, but I always tell them, you know, be ready to test it and be careful to test it. But when you test with truth, you're honest with them, you start being more and more honest, typically it's either going to get better or it's going to get worse. So I always kind of give them that warning. So basically I'm saying, be willing to lose a dishonest relationship rather than hold on to a dishonest relationship. I hope that
it
it's
is,
not too harsh.
and if I may play a devil's advocate here, so what about in the context of a family member?
Well, that's different.
Where you can't drop them.
That's different. I think you still, first of all, you have to make sure you're in a good place so that you can be more honest and you're not devastated if they don't. Basically, being honest with someone is an invitation to being closer to them. It's an invitation to intimacy. And so you tend to go into that hoping they'll hear you and you'll both leave this conversation feeling closer, but you risk the opposite happening and more emotional distance. So be careful before you go into that you're watching your own expectations and needs and you're ready to experience the distance if that's how it goes.
So this particular question comes from a young person who asks, how do you not give up hope when you're single, getting old, that is over 30 years old?
One thing is it's so much worse to feel lonely within a marriage than to be single in your 30s and not married. It's so much worse. And I just say that sitting across from a lot of lonely wives who will never experience intimacy with their husband. The other thing to remember is we are responsible for our own happiness. And I think it's really important to work on me first so that when he comes along, I'm ready for him, if that makes sense.
And there I was.
Yes.
No, that's a good point. It's interesting.
That is a good point.
Sometimes I think married couples or brides and their family put a whole lot more work into the wedding ceremony than they do in being prepared themselves in their character, in their spiritual nature to be that good spouse, to be that person who's a good partner. And that doesn't work real well. I've got a family member who got married to what seemed like a wonderful guy, and 2 years later they were divorced. And then you start looking back at how they formed their relationship and what went on. You realize they got started off on not only the wrong foot, but they didn't put the time in to get to know each other. Rachel and I met at a Christian school where there were a lot of limitations on how much time you could spend together. It was quite limited. So what was incredibly important to us is to be able to spend our time on our vacations, summers, Christmas breaks, spring breaks, to get to know each other in our natural environments. So I would go to her house and see how she did there. She'd come to my place. So if I were a woman looking for a husband and needed to evaluate him, I could say, how does he treat his mom? How does he treat his sisters? What's his view of women? And you can't see that out on dates. You see that when they're with their families. And conversely, too, for a woman to be appraising, how does he treat his mom? I think I said that.
How about the reverse?
Yes, the other reverse. So
if you're the guy.
So if the guys, I'd want to see how does she treat her mom? And are they close? Are they able to communicate emotionally? And I just watch how she treats people in her family, because that's a really big clue as to what kind of spouse they're going to be. So that takes time. Nothing chills me more than someone saying, hey, I met this person 6 weeks ago and we're getting married. I just have this shock that goes through my body, like what's the chances of that going well? And I would say that even if they're older and have been through a couple relationships, it still is not enough time to get to know that person. So it's important that you spend time with them, with their families, and get to see who they are.
Yeah, I would totally echo that and add, and also see them in differing environment. You said the environment, but like in moods. Like if under incredible stressful situation, how does that person react? How does that person handle anger and different forms? So seeing the person in all aspects, I think, is very, very important.
Absolutely.
But before we leave this question, I do want to go back to that word hope. Hope seems to be a very elusive thing today, and something that people seek, but they're not they don't even know how to seek it. So aside from a religious context, what would you say to the young adults who are seeking hope?
One thing I would say to them is to be careful how much negativity they take in, because there is so much negative about our culture, and there are so many things that aren't right, that it's really easy to get just cynical and jaundiced and negative, to where it just wipes out the hope that things can be better, that there is something better that can happen. So there we're back to what we take in. I personally have stopped watching the news for a couple reasons. One, it gets me upset. It just makes me mad, some of those things that are going on. I get all wrapped around the axle about it, and that's not good for me. I have enough things to get wrapped around the axle about than watching some newscasts, which I know they're telling you all the bad stuff. I know that, but I still watch it. So I've cut that out of my life for the most part, because there's so much negativity. It's hard to feel hopeful when all you're taking in is the negativity. So I would invite them to look at what's good, to focus on what's good, and that can give us hope, the things that actually are working in their lives. And not focus on the state of the world or even the state of the economy or those kinds of things. That's not always good news.
Yeah, I think take responsibility for your hope, just like we're responsible for our happiness. I think we're responsible for our hope. For the person of faith, I think it is a little bit easier, but I think we can have hope in our future. We can have hope in a project we're working on, and it's going to look great when it's done. Goals, more friendships, just all kinds of things.
Right.
One thing that builds hope is to get little wins.
Yeah.
Experience little wins. Build on that win, then build on that win, and that creates hope that the next win's coming.
Yeah.
I think we lose hope when we feel like everything we do is failing.
Right.
So go for something really reasonable, really easy, and feel good about it, and then build on it.
And going back to that friend question, if that friend is just very draining and negative and brings all that into your life, you really should evaluate that friendship.
Yep, you need to ask yourself some hard questions.
Exactly.